Hello and welcome to The Sacred Speaks. My name is John Price. I'm your host. I'm excited to bring you this interview, and I'll get to details about some of the podcast information soon, but let me introduce him first, and then we'll get started. Mark Ryan is an historian of American thought and culture. Dr. Ryan was the dean of Jonathan Edwards College and teacher of American Studies and History at Yale University for more than 20 years. Subsequently, he was titular floor professor at the Universidad de las Americas in Puebla, Mexico, where he also served as dean of the college's regent, and Jose Gallos College, and coordinator of the master's degree program in United States Studies. He holds a PhD and master's degree from Yale University, a master's from the University of Texas at Austin, and a bachelor's from the University of St. Thomas. Mark is the author of A Different Dimension, Reflections on the History of Transpersonal Thought, A Collegiate Way of Living, out of Yale University, 2001, and articles on various journals on higher education, and articles in the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology and related publications on the history of psychology. He is certified by Groff Transpersonal Training as a practitioner of holotropic breathwork, served for 14 years on the Board of Trustees at Nairobi University, is past chair of the Board of Directors of Wisdom University, and past chair and current trustee of the Jonathan Edwards Trust at Yale. Living now in his native city of Houston, Mark teaches and lectures at the C.G. Young Educational Center and other venues, and is a principal facilitator of Holotropic Breathwork Houston. Check that out at holotropicbreathworkhouston.com. And I serve on the Young Center's curriculum committee with Mark, and as I say in the interview, it's really nice to get to know him in a new way. And the book certainly blew my mind. This transpersonal thing is really, really important to dig into. So thanks, Mark. Really, thank you for your time, and thank you for your wisdom, and thanks for writing this book and presenting it to us. And I'll get to the interview in a couple of minutes. I just want to get to a couple of details about the podcast. If you're new, welcome. Or if you've been around for a while, welcome. The podcast has an audio and a video component, so it's available on all the podcast affiliates. You can check it out at SoundCloud, iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, all those places. And also, it is available on YouTube. So if you're listening to this, check it out on YouTube and like and subscribe to the page. And if you're same thing watching it on YouTube, thank you, and check it out on all these affiliates and like and share and subscribe to those. It helps as the project and the podcast grows and expands itself. So The Sacred Speaks, you can get tons of information on the website at thesacredspeaks.com. And there's a new website that is coming out for The Sacred Speaks, and be looking for that in the next 3 weeks probably. Also, The Sacred Speaks is brought to you by the Center for the Healing Arts and Sciences. It's a boutique integrative wellness clinic that my wife and I started. And we've got tons of information about how we serve folks in Houston and Texas and beyond. Check that out at thecenterforhas.com. And also, I guess the last thing I need to talk about music. If you've been listening to the podcast for a while, you know I'm obsessed with music, and music has been a really big part of this podcast. But in particular, there's a group called Modern Nations, and that's the theme song that I use for each episode. And if you hang out to the end of the episode, you'll hear the full song. Certainly click below, and you can go to their website and check out all the cool music that they're putting out into the world. Thanks, Nolan, and thanks, Toby. As far as today's concerned, I think that'll do it. And, the other thing that's happening I've been talking about is the Sacred Series. It's a YouTube channel that is coming out hopefully within the next month. And I'm going to be reviewing a lot of these podcast episodes, all the podcast episodes, starting with episode 1, and amplifying and synthesizing some of the information that's presented within. This information is just too good. These folks I've been interviewing for 4 years now are just important in, of course, my own development, but important in the context of depth thinking and feeling and mysticism and religion and psychology and anthropology and on and on and on. And I'm constantly and consistently grateful. By the way, those of you who are commenting on YouTube, thank you. I enjoy the back and forth, and I've actually ordered a number of the books that have been recommended. So there's a cool community out there, and you guys are wise and have a lot of insight. So thank you. Thanks for your comments. Thanks for your engagement, and thanks for participating. So I'll for now I'll leave it there, and thank you, Mark Ryan, for participating. Mark, it's a joy actually to sit with you. And as we were laughing a second ago, we were at risk of starting the interview before we started the interview. I'm glad I'm glad I had the wisdom to shut up and get eager to chat with you and hit record. So it's wonderful to have you here, and thank you for making the time.
Well, John, I'm delighted to be here. This is such a wonderful project you're involved in, and I'm honored to be part of it. Just before uh, tuning in here, I had trying to tune in myself, and I usually get a hit before, say, teaching a class of what's needed. And
Mm.
what immediately came to me was I just connect with John. It's John and his depth and his personality that I want to just bathe in. And out of that, I think can come whatever needs to come out about this book and whatever I have to say. So
I'll take a hit of that, man. I'm down with that. Well, thanks, really, because you and I, a dear colleague and friend of mine, Nanine Ewing, has been a friend for years, and she's died recently. And what was so radical about knowing her and then interviewing her, and I remember what I said to her was, it's really wonderful to get to know you in a new way. And you and I, our lives intersect in all kinds of interesting ways. And now I've read your book, and we're going to get to talk about your development, your intellectual history, your spiritual history, and kind of how you got to some of these thoughts, and certainly the lineages that you're in. And I'm just eager to get to know you in that way, Mark. It's a fruitful experience.
well, I could feel that, and the same goes right back to you.
Amen, man. Well, let's. So I what I will have done is provide your bio in the intro piece, and so people will be a bit oriented to you. And rather than starting with the bio, which we'll certainly get to, because I think that's important for all of us to know and be able to contextualize somebody's experience within that kind of narrative. I also want to begin with a quote here, because one thing I was going to tell you earlier. Hang on, I'm looking for my glasses. One thing I was going to tell you earlier is that your book really look at that. I got like 14. Yeah, I've done. I can't tell you how many times I've done that. I get to watch this stuff back, and I'm like, all right, man, you're wearing two sets of glasses on your head.
I'll be interested to see whether that stays in the edits or not.
No, that's definitely going in. Yeah, that will be in there. Only because I'm kind of a. I mean, sometimes I edit stuff out when it needs to be edited out, but for the most part, I have this like, I want a genuine conversation. So I'm sure I need to deal with that, because from the observer's perspective, they're like, we don't need to see that shit. But I think, to your point, when you bathe in real conversation, I think we're thirsty for that. And as a psychotherapist, it's kind of my weekly process is I'm consistently bathing in conversation with people in really intimate ways, and I want that to be a part of what this is. So I appreciate your word there.
I got it. I feel the same thing in the class when we have a small, really engaged group. Things come out of me, surprise me. Right?
Oh man, it does. And I as you teach, and we'll certainly talk about your experience in academia, but as you teach, I do think there's a moment where we realize, like, the larger the class gets, the less intimate it can become. So I do like those small groups. So here I had teed up. This I may edit out because I'm trying to find this quote. Yeah, good. I found it fast. So I want to begin with this because and see and believe me, you go wherever you like to go. I just offer this up for our container here. I starred this. I put a line next to it. I said, quote this in the margin. So obviously I want to begin. This is the way you start chapter 7 in your book. And by the way, folks, you'll see plenty of stuff here. This is the book, A Different Dimension, Reflections on the History of Transpersonal Thought by Mark B. Ryan. And I've been reading your work now, of course, for a couple of weeks in and out, and it's a meaningful narrative that I need to hear. And so again, it's kind of meeting me exactly where I needed to be met as far as my own kind of psychological and spiritual development is concerned. So I'll start with this, and then we'll just jump in, and I'll shut up. The basic idea of transpersonal psychology may be infinitely profound, but it can be stated simply. Our individual ego, our sense of personal self, and the psyche that sustains it, is embedded in an interconnected cosmos. Our personal psyche reaches into and is penetrated by a collective consciousness, a natural ambience, a spiritual foundation and context. Our individual consciousness stretches, then, beyond the personal. It has dimensions that are transpersonal. A fuller understanding of the human psyche must take account of those connections of the psyche's reach into the wider realms of consciousness, as exemplified in extraordinary human experiences that stretch the bounds of our awareness. We are dealing here, then, with a scientific and empirical study of mind oriented towards spirit, a spiritual psychology. Thank you for that. Anybody got Mark's book? It's on page 127, beginning of chapter 7. I figured we'd start there because that I thought was a wonderfully concise, beautiful definition of transpersonal psychology.
Thank you, John. Thank you for pointing out some of my better prose there. That's not only what I think transpersonal psychology is about, but it's a statement of the broader thesis of the book. You may notice that the frontispiece, as we call it, the little blurb at the very front of the book, is from William James, and it's saying the same thing. Let me begin with that. The further limits of our being plunge, it seems to me, into an altogether other dimension of existence from the sensible and merely understandable world. Name it the mystical region or the supernatural reason, whichever you choose. We belong to it in a more intimate sense than that in which we belong to the visible world. Now, the passage you read starts part 2 of the book, I believe, which is specifically about the field of transpersonal psychology, so-called, right? And I think in general, what I was trying to do with this book is really twofold. One is somewhat addressed to people who might have the kind of orientation that you and I have, that are just tending towards that view of the world that you just stated. And some of them are in transpersonal psychology as a field and know the term, know the name, and know something about it. That field has been self-defined as more or less beginning in the late 1960s with the work of Abraham Maslow, Stanislav Grof, the influx of Asian thought into Western psychology, really incorporating it, figure like Ken Wilbur. Mm-hmm. So these are people who really saw themselves as starting a revolution within the field of psychology. Maslow called it the fourth force, right? And they saw what they were doing in the late 1960s as a revolution, brand new, something that was really almost unprecedented. And my field is the history of ideas. So as I got involved with that through the marvelous intervention of Stanislav Grof, primarily, I felt that this resonated with a lot of things I had read before, and that the field itself wasn't quite fully cognizant of its predecessors. Mm-hmm. So part of what I was trying to do was to show the audience for transpersonal psychology that the foundation here, these basic ideas, really stretch back to the beginning of the field of psychology as a formal academic field in the late 19th century. So that was one thing, and that's a little bit academic, right? That's kind of addressed towards a more specific audience. that's knows the term transpersonal psychology. But the other effort of the book was to present the foundational ideas in a way that would be accessible for a general public. Mm-hmm. So to talk about the origins of some of these ideas within the field of modern psychology. We may trace the ideas back to practically the beginning of time, but certainly to the Gnostics, say. But what I was looking at was how these ideas really affected the field of psychology as it defined itself as a science. And to note that these ideas are being drawn on as a way of explaining empirical data rather than out of a spiritual conviction of some sort.
So, well, that gets into the nut, right? That's like the central issue, you know, that like even to borrow from Jung for a second, this anybody who's read any of Jung knows about the personality 1 and 2 of this kind of bouncing back and forth between a more reductive scientific materialist worldview versus a kind of more unbounded, we would say, kind of mystical space. And essentially what you're doing is you're giving credence to the limitations of the larger conversation happening in academic psychology, certainly, and in sciences.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I think Jung is a key figure here. He's not a figure I explore so fully in the book because he's written about so much.
Right.
He's recognized. He was recognized by founders of transpersonal psychology, so-called, when they started using the name, as a predecessor. Mm-hmm. And people like Stan Grof and others often refer to him as, Grof uses the term, the first transpersonal psychologist, even though he didn't call himself that. But Jung has been so fully explored and recognized in that way. What I wanted to do was to call attention to some figures who were not so recognized as tied to this emerging field, and see how their world of ideas really were coming to play here, just as they came to play in the thought of Carl Jung.
Well, it may be here, I mean, to kind of put a little pin here, because I find I know you, and I also don't know your background as well as I want to. And so can we do a little personal narrative here, your own experience to kind of end or bring us to this point where we're talking about your desire and interest in exploring this kind of lineage of transpersonal psychology?
Well, sure. I came through a very dogmatic Catholic education in more pre-Vatican II world, right? So this is the late 1950s, and there was something in me that was both trapped by and rebelling against the dogmatism. Mm-hmm. And as I grew in my thought, I tried to release myself from the trap and reach out into different ways of seeing the world. And that I went to a Catholic university here in Houston, University of St. Thomas. And that actually was the beginning of a kind of liberation, because it was the thinking at the time was not, well, it ran the gamut, I suppose, but it was not presented predominantly as a kind of dogmatism, but as a field for thought and discussion. And I responded to that, but eventually it took me out of the Catholicism. And I believed very strongly in liberal education.
Mm-hmm.
That was an ideology at St. Thomas, and it was a beautiful world in that time. There were 600 students in this little school, but that was at the time when the Menil family was heavily involved, and Dominique de Menil was establishing the art department, and the thought of Vatican II was enlivening things in the church, and there was a very vibrant movement in literary criticism. My major was in English literature. It was felt very vibrant at the time of what was called form criticism or new criticism. And so I felt I got away from those Catholic ideas and that conception that I had grown up with, a very simplistic, puerile conception, I would think, of how reality was constituted. And I felt that as I went through a pretty secular phase of my PhD dissertation. I then went on to University of Texas, where I picked up a master's degree, and then my doctorate was at the it was at Yale University in American Studies, which was mostly in the field of American thought.
Was your master's in literature?
No, my master's was in American civilization, the field was called. I actually wrote a master's thesis on William James, who permeates this book.
Yes, thankfully.
And but even though my PhD dissertation was a very secular character called H.L. Mencken, who really saw himself as an iconoclast tearing down ideas. And but he was a fabulous writer, which was what most drew me to him. Cultural critic and a social critic. But there was always a part of me that was a seeker. And I got away from all organized religious life for quite a while. But there was something in me that was looking for that broader context. And I do credit the Catholic education as a big part of that, of just showing me the world's bigger than the kind of goals we tend to set for ourselves in modern life. And I moved, I began searching in various ways. I went through, some of us are old enough to remember the first enthusiasm for transcendental meditation in the 1970s, perhaps. And I got into meditation and yoga and and I was drawn in my own field to transcendentalist thinking, figures like Ralph Waldo Emerson, particularly Thoreau, the notions coming out of the early 19th century that are pretty close to the basic frame of thought of modern transpersonal psychology, I'd say. And but then I did a lot of psychotherapy too, psychotherapy of different kinds, bioenergetics. I saw a bioenergetic therapist for many years, and that revealed a lot to me about mind-body connections that weren't part of my dualistic upbringing. And then I got in somewhere around the late 80s. A friend of mine who was very early trained by Stan and Christina Groff in the mid 70s, I suppose, well, later 70s probably. Anyway, he got a training in holotropic breath work and introduced me to that field. And I did some of it drew me, some of it struck me as the ideas of people that I ran into struck me as further out than I could go at the time. I
was really careful. It's well said.
I wasn't ready for reincarnation, for example.
Yeah.
And the but I went to my first workshop with Stan Groff in the early 90s, I guess. And I got really intrigued in that direct experience that could seem to come. It really drove one in deeper into the subconscious mind than certainly is our custom. And I realized that worked. And I kind of went along with that in a fairly light way until there was a point when I was on leave in teaching at a university in Mexico, on leave from Yale. And I decided it might be time to look further into the work of Groff, his writings. He's a voluminous writer, as well as the creator of this technique. And I had this St. Augustine-like experience. I was rummaging in the library at the University in Mexico, which had some of Stan's books, but I was just vaguely going up to that section of the shelf. And I acknowledge I disturbed the shelf in some way, just perhaps thumbing through it. And literally, this book fell on the floor in front of me. And it was Stan Groff's, what I think of as his magnum opus called Beyond the Brain. And Stan is a marvelous intellectual historian himself. So although he's primarily a medical man and a psychiatrist, he a psychologist. He was really in that book trying to tie the direct experiences that he had written about and investigated through psychedelic drugs, the clinical use of psychedelic drugs, and the holotropic breath work with broader concepts that were changing in the culture at the time, and with the new physics, for example. And so I got really intrigued by that, and that kind of set me on a path of putting together. It helped pull together my experiential spiritual searches with my intellectual training in the history of ideas, and really led me, I'd say, to a current stance which could always change. I get a little frightened by people who say they return to their religious roots.
I don't want to go back there, man.
But to a stance which it's sympathetic to the movement we call spiritual, but not religious.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing I see this book as doing is attempting, along with many others, to show a lineage, to display a lineage of rich thought that can stand under this movement of spiritual but not religious that is often characterized as quite shallow. And I guess my argument here is that there's a rich lineage of thought that really focuses on the sense that the religious search is primarily in the personal depths, as we spoke of as you spoke of in that opening quotation you read, and that I did with that frontispiece from William James. You have to go deep within and find ways of penetrating your subconscious mind to reach the level of spirituality that you're capable of.
Well, and let's contain that for a moment, because it seems to me that the reason why there's a certain association with a shallowness of spiritual but not religious, critics would say something like, yeah, but you can kind of just go wherever your feelings take you. You know, if something's uncomfortable, you go over there and find something new. And so you're not held accountable to the kind of depths of that particular tradition. You referenced this in your book when you were talking about how a lot of the kind of broader religious traditions that we have been cultivated, created, adapted, moved through centuries and centuries of transformation. So ostensibly, they've kind of burned off any of the unnecessary parts of the tradition or the structure that have been deemed to be unnecessary. And so there is something of a like, yeah, you can't be held accountable. And I understand that. And yet also, I bet somebody who is part of the spiritual but not religious community would say, yes, but it's almost totally about subjectivity. It's almost entirely based upon your feelings and, you know, where your images and your dreams and kind of that more personal orientation. I see the critique in that, and of course, I'm sure the answer is some kind of a both and. But we tend to forget that the spiritual but not religious community is interrelated in really important ways with the extremely religious community. Is that fair to say? Secular, sacred kind of dynamics? Does that make sense even?
Well, I think so. You know, it's all part of a spiritual search, right? And many people live their lives without the need for that, and that's fine. That may be fine, but for those of us who feel like you want to have some sense of that wider context of reality,
Yeah.
We're kind of driven towards some kind of a search. And I certainly respect the people who do that through very orthodox paths, because those paths have been worked out for millennia.
Right.
And two of my closest friends I would immediately think of. One's a rabbi, and the other one's an Episcopal bishop. And we get together, the three of us, and trade our points of view around on a monthly basis at least. And I have a great respect for that, because I feel like ultimately we're all involved in the same endeavor.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, with my wounding from the terrors with which I was raised, that orthodox path has not seemed like a way to go, at least not in the way I've known of it. So, and what I feel like has come out of the kinds of experiences I have had, depth experiences that I have had, as you get into those deeper reaches within, you're reaching beyond your own personality. Mm-hmm. So it's not just a solipsistic.
God, that term, man, that idea of solipsism haunts me. Yes, absolutely.
If you get into that deeply enough, you find yourself in connection with so much else. You
yes.
find, I believe, I have a running argument with Jeff Kripal about this, but I believe that you hit a point of love, and that connects you with others, and you hit a point of a sense of social responsibility, and you may get into an experience where you're viewing the world through some other eyes. You know, the notion of transpersonal psychology is that your own self can identify, so that you feel it subjectively. Mm-hmm. The experience of not only other people, but collective experiences, animal experiences, maybe even inanimate world. That gets further out than many people could.
Well, and to define this really, there's something fascinating about, if it were entirely subjective, there wouldn't really be any patterning that we could speak of or share. Like, you know, there are certain patterns that I'm assuming manifest spontaneously in your mystical experience, And if I compared that to my mystical experience, we would have an ability to share. Oh, that happened to you? My version of that was this. Or the disembodied entity, was a feminine voice for me, and it was a marsupial for you, or what, but there's some kind of other. And so what is fascinating about you bringing solipsism into this, and I want to define that for folks, because there are, my understanding, right, is this is a kind of a narcissistic, egocentric philosophical worldview that is essentially, you are the center point and totality of reality, and that's it. Like, this is you're the the writer, the director, the protagonist, the antagonist, and the tables and chairs. Would you add anything to that, or?
Well, what immediately comes to my mind is your friend Carl Jung. There are two selves, right?
Man, yes.
Smaller
Yes.
self, which is the personal ego, which is what we're talking about with that solipsism.
Yes.
And then there's the self with a capital S, which is that point of connection. I'd say it's the same things William James was talking about in that frontispiece.
Mm-hmm.
Deeper reaches of our being plunge into an altogether other dimension of existence than the merely visible, merely understandable world, visible and merely understandable world. So that Jung had adopted this basically Asian notion of an Atman, right?
Yeah.
That the divine resides within you in some way. And if you connect with that, you do connect with something that's universal. Now, as you know, there's a major discussion in the intellectual world about constructivism versus perennialism in these matters, and how much is really universal and how much is necessarily comes out of our cultural upbringing.
Local, yeah.
But I think there is a viable middle ground there. Our friend Jeff Kripal tries to explore it.
Yep.
You also hit a fundamental reality that's universal. It may not be experienced in exactly the same way, but there are patterns of experience that reach across cultural lines. Another wonderful phrase of William James that comes to my mind here is, I'm probably not going to be able to recall it verbatim, but it has a notion that the mysticism ultimately has no culture or creed.
Mm-hmm.
Beyond that, and it's a question would be, where in that process of that mystical contact do you begin to be completely influenced by cultural formation? And that's a discussion, right?
Well, and, the piece here that I want to clarify, or I want clarity, because I'm obviously not in this tradition of the constructivist perspective, because I push it along and I say, okay, it's like language. It's a locally constructed form that is influenced by the environment, by the stories and the narratives, and so on and so forth. But the fact is, we all have the capacity to learn a language. What do constructivists say when it comes to that? Like, if I have the seat that can, or the vessel that can be filled with all kinds of different experience or information, the pattern is the vessel. Like, we all got a vessel. Where does the perennialist or the pluralism and constructivism, where do they intersect and where do they not intersect?
Yeah. Well, actually, that gets to, I think, a central theme of the book, which is transmission theory, filter theory. So the constructivist, at least as I view it, and I don't pretend to bring expertise here, but I have thought about it. the constructivists basically accept the materialistic view of modern Western society, that all consciousness comes from the human brain. And this was an issue. It's a perfect issue to I think talk about themes of the book, because I remember Stan Groff talking about the notion of you don't have to consider it all coming from the brain. It's more like a television set, that there may be a world of consciousness out there. And this he came to, I must say, through experiment, through scientific clinical work, not through preordained prejudices, that you get beyond the brain. That was the title of his book. Mm-hmm. And you have, there is consciousness out there that the brain processes. No one would deny that the brain has a great influence on thought and experience. But the notion is that doesn't mean that the brain produces it. There could be a world of consciousness, intelligence out there that the brain processes. And that notion goes back to my friend William Jay. Well, he called it the transmission theory, and in a lecture at Harvard in the 1880s, he made the distinction between the brain as a producer of consciousness and the brain as a transmitter of consciousness. So that it may, in most instances, perhaps produce, but that doesn't mean that there isn't part of our experience that can reach beyond what our normal brain, our brain, the influences that have normally formed our cerebral operations, right? So that we can get to something that's, we may not know how to articulate it. It's ineffable in James's term about mysticism, but something that convinces people who've had that experience that there is a reality out there that is way beyond the visible and merely understandable world.
Yeah, I like that term, the invisible. And I want to even back up a little bit, because something I loved so much about your book was this, and now I get it, because you let me know what your master's and doctorate were all about. So could we back up, because I want to contextualize this. You're labeling a couple of names, but the attention that you paid to the lineage, I think, was a real gift in your book. And just for those of you, of course, that haven't read the book yet, it ranges from the paranormal to the mystical to the dogmatic to these practices that are used in various communities, and specifically the Bonnie method and the holotropic breath work. And so backing up really far, you said earlier, American civilization, that was your master's, right? And
That's
so
right.
Would you speak a bit about what is unique about American mystical or spiritual perspective and thought? What is that lane, American traditional spirituality?
Well, I wouldn't call it unique, because I think, we're all linked to a wider world, including American thinkers, even in the earlier centuries. But there's a strain of American thought here that I think comes to a kind of flowering transpersonal psychology. You would trace it back to, you could certainly trace it earlier. I mean, the foundations of the colonies in New England were in some measure mystical. We have a figure like Jonathan Edwards might be the first American mystic who was trying to explain his own religious experience, which was very profound, in the context of Calvinistic theology and also Enlightenment thought. But that gets a little earlier than I think the direct lineage I want to point to here, which is from transcendentalist thinkers in the early 19th century. Now, they weren't unique. They were drawing on German Romanticism, but you have really outstanding figures like Ralph Waldo Emerson, Margaret Fuller, slightly later Walt Whitman, who had a sense, who wanted to honor all the emerging scientific and empirical thought that was coming to the fore in their time, but also had a strong sense of a transcendental reality. And that where my book really picks up, it makes allusions to that context earlier, but where it really picks up is with the emergence of the field of modern psychology, which was trying to make the study of the psyche a science. Mm-hmm. Therefore, trying to, before the 1880s, the field of anything that you would call psychology or the study of the psyche would have been part of a department of philosophy in a university. It's speculation, because that's some of it was highly sophisticated speculation about one's own personal experience, but it's still that didn't involve scientific investigation of other people's experience and trying to tie explanations to empirical facts that could be named and explored, and to experiment. And the first laboratories in the psychological laboratories in the United States were formed in the 1870s. Mm-hmm. And what we have generally, the professional field of psychology went through, as I see it as a historian, went through a field in which different ideas were coming to the fore. But around the early 20th century, it pretty much got focused on behaviorism, which is about as scientific and materialistic as you can go, trying to tie all human behavior to physical facts, or Freudian psychoanalysis, right? Which really begins to spread radically in the 1920s or so, maybe after 1910 into the 20s. But there was another strain. There was another strain of psychological investigators who did not abandon that sense of, they wanted to be as scientific as could be in their approach, tying their ideas to empirical investigation, but they turned to some of these ideas that made room for a sense of spirit, as Freud did not, and behaviorism certainly didn't. Forms of explanation that made room for that because they thought they explained the data better. And that's where the paranormal comes in. We had, the book has these chapters on R.M. Buck, who's a Canadian psychologist who wrote.
Thank you for that, by the way. I really enjoyed your treatment of his work.
Well, I see it's very significant historically. He came up with the notion cosmic consciousness. He based it on he didn't invent the term exactly, but his famous book was called Cosmic Consciousness. And he himself had this mystical experience that he tried to explain by looking deeply into the literature, into really a lot of world literature, where other people might have had such experiences. And he tried to explain their experiences very much in terms of his own mystical experiences, which had its both its insights and its limitations. But then it goes through. He was his Cosmic Consciousness was published in 1901, I think, and then we get into William James's the whole discovery. The whole discovery of the unconscious mind, right? And now you toss that idea out on the street, and then somebody who picks it up will think, oh, well, that begins with Freud, right? But my book, I hope, demonstrates that the notion was there well before Freud, and we can trace it through these figures like Frederick Myers, whom I explore in some depth in one of these chapters. He was a British investigator of the paranormal, who was trying to look into the experience of mediums who would go into trance states, right? They would go into trance states, and then they would know things that they had no way of knowing in their ordinary lives. Frederick Myers, William James got very involved in this too. They were both together. They were both instrumental in this in the formation in the early years of a group called the SPI. What does the SPI stand for? In any case, it was investigating the paranormal in these early years in a time when spiritualism, which is to say these mediums trying to make contact with the dead, was in vogue.
And let me let's set something up, because I'm conscientious of the terminology here regarding in particular the Freudian and the behaviorism and the materialism, and let me try to put it in my own words and make sure that that I'm tracking. So essentially, what I hear you saying is that there is a split in our intellectual and spiritual traditions, and it can be. It manifests in our universities. It's a split between the sciences, what we call the sciences, and the humanities. And in the one, we have a method in order to observe, measure, and replicate phenomena, and test. We come up with hypotheses, and we test hypotheses through this method that is a very effective method and is a valuable method. Although there's a limitation, because there are aspects of reality that aren't subjected to replication, that are unmeasurable, that we would consider to be more qualitative, less quantitative, that are more subjective. And of course, we can get into a whole conversation about subjectivity and objective and all that we may get into, but we may not. So the imagination is the arena of the humanities in a lot of ways. And so what happens is that science is getting more and more refined and more broad in its cultural applications. What you see are these parts of subjective experience. What Kripal, when I talked to him, he talked about the paranormal being that which is outside of what is normal, what is known. We don't have any rational understanding of why these things are happening or what is going on. So it gets kicked out into this catch-all drawer of the paranormal. But science doesn't quite know what to do with that because of the limitations, albeit very effective and valuable and important, the limitations of that method, so that there are these folks who are saying, hey, let's not forget about this. Whether it's a placebo or whatever, we can't just wish it away by categorizing it as something that just happens. And so there are folks who really wanted to understand, even recognizing that our rational thinking and certain technological limitations of the time prevent us from being able to understand and connect with aspects of these experiences. But nonetheless, there still are all of these experiences that many people have. And just for anybody listening, I do think it's important to note that for me, what happens when I start thinking about the paranormal is I immediately get a bit skeptical, and I have trust issues. I think I have trust issues with the paranormal because there's a bunch of bullshit out there, and there's a bunch of charlatans, and there's a bunch of people that are taking advantage of a human desire to connect with the transcendent. So people have, whether they are intentional or not, they've kind of muddied the waters. But regardless of that, I could say the same thing about science. There's a bunch of bullshit in there, and there's a bunch of charlatans out there. You just go to any scientific research center and say, how many people have actually intentionally fucked with their data? Tons, like tons. So I just want to solve that for myself, because I do look at, I have the charlatan thing, but if we're going to blame, we've got to blame honestly and equally. And so we need to blame both sides and recognize that the critique I'm giving to this side is also a critique I need to give to this side. And now we can have an open conversation, because the thought that blows my mind when it comes to the paranormal is 99.9% of all of paranormal experience could be totally false. Totally like, somebody created this to mess with people, 99.9%, but 0.1%, if it actually does hint at a reality beyond our understanding, then it's right, which blows my fucking mind.
May I run with that?
Oh, yes, please.
Beautiful oration there, John. This is exactly what the strain that runs through the whole book. But what we're dealing with here, both in transpersonal psychology and in these earlier figures I'm talking about, was an attempt to pull those worlds together.
Yeah.
Create a tertium quid, a third thing that would honor both and the use of the truth of both. When transpersonal psychology tried to define itself around 1970, it said that it was one of its main purposes was to investigate what it referred to as extraordinary personal experiences. And that included things like mystical experiences, and it included things like the paranormal. And they saw that as a revolutionary thing because it hadn't been done for the previous 50 years, because psychology wouldn't admit to it as a field. But the figures I'm talking about, who were earlier in psychology, were trying to do exactly that. They were investigating these extraordinary personal experiences. In the case of the SPI, referred to as the Society for Psychical Research, they were looking at experiences that were undeniable because they found thousands of them, but they that couldn't be explained by our materialistic view of the world.
Right.
And yet they wanted to investigate those things as scientifically as possible. They all conceived of themselves as men of science. James was trained in physiology and biology, and he went to the Amazon to study geology, went to then his degree was in medical school, but he and Frederick Myers and the SPI were looking into cases like crisis apparitions. A crisis apparition is when you have a sudden experience of somebody else, usually a loved one, somebody you're really close to. Mm-hmm. That person is going through a crisis, normally death. Right? And these experiences are reported universally.
Oh, yeah.
They published a book in 1886 on that had 900 such cases. This was a British publication by the Society for Psychical Research. And and these were cases that were all verified. That is to say, they tossed out, they didn't consider anything that was just a report of one person. It had to happen so that there was other testimony that the recipient, the person who had this experience, mentioned it to someone else before it was actually discovered that the agent, that is the person who seemingly the focus of the experience, had gone through this crisis. So, and they tried to trace down that style of verification according to the scientific canons of the time. And they had cases like that just can't be explained by the notion that all knowledge comes through the senses.
Mm-hmm.
He said if there's one exception to that, then
that's right.
That tells us something about reality.
Yes.
James was wonderful at phrase for that. He said, Mrs. Piper, and I'll tell you about her in a second, Mrs. Piper is my white crow. That is, in order to prove that not all crows are black, you don't have to show that no crows are black. You just have to find that one frigging white crow.
One crow, that's right.
And Leonora Piper was a Boston middle-class housewife who was a medium. And William James was dragged to her very skeptically by his own mother-in-law. And he, because she had been to a seance with her, and she started spouting things in this trance state that were things about his own family that she had no way of knowing. And that intrigued the scientific investigator and psychologist. And from then on, he was arguing that science itself tosses out these experiences because they don't fit with the worldview of the science of the time. And he had a beautifully sophisticated argument about how that's always changing, that scientific worldview. But nevertheless, he realized that what transpersonal psychologists later rediscovered, that in trance states, like through psychedelic drugs or through holotropic breath work, people can hit experiences in reality that they have no way of knowing in their ordinary life. Now, Leonora Piper was, she never took money for any of this, as many mediums did. And as you say, there was a huge amount of fraud in the field.
Right.
And in fact, the Society for Psychical Research, one of its main goals was to expose all the fraud. And it had people involved in it that thought the mediumship was entirely bunk. And they found a huge amount of fraud. But they also found these other cases that they just couldn't explain. And Leonora Piper went through all kinds of testing. They would isolate her. They would put her in, have her deal with people who she had never met before. She was taken to Britain so this could happen. And in these states, she would know things that just could not be explained through the ordinary patterns of knowledge. And that was what influenced these people as scientific investigators. And so when I started studying William James, he was taught as the American pragmatist. We didn't learn this at all, that this was one of his great interests, because it would have been an embarrassment. But he, Frederick Myers, he delved into this research and wrote voluminously about these kinds of trance experience, including 70 sittings he had with Leonora Piper. And, you know, a lot of it was trivial. A lot of it just didn't make sense. He never reached any conclusions about whether she was actually um, contacting um, spirits of the dead. In fact, he thought probably not.
And let me just a thought occurs to me because insight or whatever. As a psychotherapist, I'm consistently connecting with people who are sharing things that they've never shared with anyone else, and usually because they feel very ashamed. So it's almost like their inner world or their imagination, like, they had some horribly violent thought, or they had a fantasy, a sexual fantasy. They shouldn't think that way. And so it's again that world of the imagination that is scary, because we don't really have a framework for that. And so they push it to the side, or they repress it or defend against it. So it's understandable that we can use kind of what happens in the micro as an understanding of what goes on in the macro, that if we don't have a particular framework collectively for an experience, we can't do anything with it. So it gets connected. As a Jungian, you'd say, it gets thrown into the shadow. It still's activated, and it has an energy field, but it doesn't get tended to consciously. So the work on psychotherapy, go on, sorry.
I'm sorry, this is quick. That's exactly what these people felt about the science of their time. So they wanted to expand the science.
Right.
And the really strong, careful empirical investigation to encompass that sort of thing.
Well, and I think what Kreipel did for me, and we were, because I gave him the example of a poltergeist, and he said, yeah, everybody thinks about a poltergeist, and it's he's not saying that you have to posit some mind over matter issue. It's that you just can't reconcile it on some level rationally. And so, of course, it gets thrown into some floating apparition, or, something is happening. I guess what's interesting for me is that, does that world exist? Does that spirit world kind of come over into the material world? But really what we're dealing with are a series, I think, are, again, at the risk of being reductive here, are a series of limitations based upon our culture, based upon our ego, based upon our development, that there are aspects of our reality that we can't comprehend. Yeah. So we don't create opportunities to commune with or connect with those, what then become pretty scary parts of ourselves. Because as a kid, if I grow up thinking that my sexuality is dirty, or is harmful, or is reserved for only these parts of time, then all of a sudden my observer here, as soon as I get turned on or have a sexual thought about somebody, all of a sudden I'm in a pit of shame, and I'm dealing with that shame. Yet if I just went to somebody and started to learn, oh, those are really natural, normal aspects of the imagination, then you don't have to create such harsh, confining containers of identity, which I think on some level is what you're saying, is that science did. I mean, science creates this. It's a method that becomes an ideology, that becomes an identity that one measures oneself against, and that anything that's not kind of seen through that prism is deemed to be a kind of amoral, bad, unnecessary, devalued kind of experience.
Yeah, I think so, John. And what these folks were doing, what modern transpersonal psychology is doing, is, let's say, trying to empirically explore the edges of the dual. Jeff Kripal's phrase, to return to him, is the human as two, yeah. Right? We have this everyday materialistic, rational side of ourselves, and we have another that we get access to, and that's that more spiritual side. And what I think all of these people that figure in this book were trying to do is to try to see how far they could go using something that could be at least related to a scientific methodology, and if possible, really following scientific canons to explore the other side, however that's experienced. Now, the mediums were experiencing it as spirits of the dead, but the people who were examining them, they were trying to find psychological experiences that, or look for these psychological elements in that. So they didn't take literally that this was necessarily your Uncle James who's come back from the other world. But how could they know the things that James seemed to know?
Would you put a little skin on that bone too? Because the two figures that I really enjoyed, I'm very obsessed with layers of what I call layers of consciousness, and of course this has been tended to by Buck, by James, by Ken Wilbur. And I've read a bit of Ken Wilbur, and in reading your work, I'm going to go back to him because his structure of the psyche I'm very interested by. And essentially, would you do an overview of some of those layers that are articulated by some of these fellas and women throughout the transpersonal movement?
Yeah, I think,
I may have caught you off guard there. I don't know.
well, no, I could do that. I'm trying to think of whom to select.
Uh-huh.
I think I'd like to go back to my mentor, Stan Groff, because Stan had his own mystical experience, very powerful mystical experience on his first clinical experience with LSD in 1956. And he was somebody who had grown up in Czechoslovakia under communist control. The general philosophy was entirely materialistic,
Mm-hmm.
and his own training was purely Freudian. And suddenly he had this experience that, like Buck's, was so powerful that it became life-defining. They just couldn't deny the reality of it. And he had this experience that consciousness was something much more fundamental than a product of the human brain. It permeated all of reality, right? And so he spent the years after that experience working in a clinical setting in Czechoslovakia with using LSD and beginning to map out scientifically that sense, right? And just record and map out what the experiences were of all these people who had gone through the use of this drug. And they begin to explore how it could be carry those people deeper and deeper into their subconscious. So we have, I mean, if you have a figure like Freud, he had a tremendous contribution to modern thought, right? Mm-hmm. With his characterization of the unconscious. And he compares the unconscious to, compares consciousness to an iceberg. Mm-hmm. The rational mind that we know every day is the tip of the iceberg, and below it is the unconscious, which he would divide into id and ego and superego, such things.
Which are personal.
All personal, right. What Groff and these transpersonal psychologists are arguing is that whole personal conscious could be seen as the tip of the iceberg. And that below it is other realms of consciousness that reach beyond the personal. Now, how Groff experienced things in his investigations was, first of all, people got far more deeply into their personal consciousness. And so that he totally honored the Freudian view. He just said it was very partial.
Yes.
And but then, not necessarily in sequence, but sometimes, often in sequence, they would have experiences that could not be explained that way. First, experiences of their own birth. And out of that, he came to the conclusion that birth itself kind of integrates the earlier work of Rank into this, Otto Rank into the canon here. That birth experience is a central experience of life that's really traumatic. And he began to cut that into stages and see different ways in which the birth experience affected the subjective mind. But it never was purely contained by that individual personality. The consciousness would then begin to reach into the transpersonal, so that, like Leonore Piper, people would be having experiences of something that they just couldn't explain from their ordinary, rational, everyday experience.
And let me interject really fast, Mark, because I want to define this too. I'm realizing we haven't really defined Freudian, and what you're hearing here, and please fix this if it's off, is that the current way we're using the signifier Freudian points to a reduction that happens in our life experience where we can almost simplify our current drama, personality, dynamic. We can simplify it back to our development. You know, the oceanic feeling that he would talk about is really a kind of a desire to reconnect with what it must have felt like being in the womb, where all of your needs are met, where you're cared for, where there are no challenges. And the fundamental trauma that we all experience is the birth trauma, where we are separated from the warm embrace of the mother. And on some level, we are attempting to recreate or replicate that kind of experience throughout our lives. And do you have anything to add to that?
Well, what Groff did was begin to really get into elements of that, the birth trauma.
And what I think you're saying is that what Groff was doing is saying yes and.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Yes, absolutely. But it goes beyond that. It goes into realms that we tend to call spiritual, and perceptions. Mm-hmm. That transcend our everyday lives, whatever we could have experienced in our everyday life. And so that we have experiences that my folks back then in the early days, like Frederick Myers, labeled supernormal. Mm-hmm. And that became the French term paranormal, which came back into English.
Bouncing around, yeah.
What Myers was trying to do was to say, this isn't heavenly realms coming in from some dualism into our world. This is part of our world. It's normal. It's just beyond the everyday.
Outside of ego consciousness.
Yeah. So one thing these people were looking for, the mediums of the time tend to explain their experiences in terms of some consciousness coming down from heaven and invading them. It was something from the outside. And these psychologists were trying to look at, as fully as they can, how could this be coming from the inside? And that drove like James into the notion that the further reaches of our further limits of our being plunge into an utterly other dimension that we call spiritual or supernatural. But for a figure like Myers, he got away from the term supernatural and use supernormal, because he was saying that it was not above nature, it was part of nature.
And this is getting back to what we were saying earlier, that if you go far enough, to use that kind of, if you go far enough into the subjective, you are connected with an objective, structured, patterned experience that is can happen to all kinds of people. I think that's kind of what we get at when we talk about the objective psyche. A lot of times we imagine it in a dual structure as ultimately separate, as opposed to paradoxically interconnected between subjective and objective, and it's kind of a both and.
Yeah, I would
track in there.
I would refine that a little, or
Please.
Maybe it's not a refining, but the patterning can vary, but the reality of confronting it seems to be universal. I use a metaphor in the book of to argue with some of the constructivism. If you could dive into the ocean in many different parts of the world and see something quite different below the surface, but the experience of the dive is pretty much the same no matter where you are. Right. And that's I think, there's such a common patterning of a mystical experience that, or at least classical mystical experience, that doesn't allow me to say it's utterly constructed. That whole notion, a Buck comes to it, and is that an underpinning of reality is love. He quotes Walt Whitman on that. Walt Whitman had apparently had a similar kind of mystical experience, and his final refrain in that stanza was, "The kelson of the creation is love." Whitman's. Now, kelson is a nautical term. It's the beam at the base of a ship that holds the whole structure together. And that so many people who have had that experience seem to have some comparable kinds of ways of talking about it, and not everybody. And and some people have terrifying mystical experiences, but there's a common enough pattern so that I'm inclined to say, don't give up on the perennialist. This is a fundamental aspect of reality.
Well, I want to be conscientious of time. So how much time do you have left? Let's give it
whatever we can go for whatever works for you. I'd say, John, another 15 minutes.
That'd be perfect. Actually, 15 minutes would be great. I want to. I have a couple threads that are hanging out, and one of again, I want to mention Wilbur. You brought him in a number of really elegant ways, again, to kind of reinforce this idea of the structure of consciousness that I find so captivating and important. And it almost, for me as a psychotherapist, it helps me understand, why we have conflict. And if we only woke up to the fact that, whether you're a fundamentalist that needs some kind of dogma that provides you a pathway, or you're a mystic, do your thing, man. I think it's like, as long as you're not harming other people and enforcing your beliefs on others, which is, of course, one of the problems of the kind of egoism of humanity, that we're so scared about walking the wrong path that we have to assert our path on other people, because the idea of them living differently than us makes us feel so totally insecure about our own footing that we got to fight them for it. It's like, don't you make me question my shit, man. And so I want to talk a little bit about Wilbur, if that's helpful. But then I also I want to ask you about, given your experiences in transpersonal psychology. You and I connected in one of the classes that we both taught, looking at Brian Murarescu's work in The Immortality Key. And I just want to ask you about the current state of psychedelics in the United States, in particular, because of your interest in American civilization. So those two threads I'd like to connect with, and anything else that you've got hanging out there.
Okay. The dog has been quieted. So yes, let me begin with Wilbur. He has had a tremendous influence in this whole world of transpersonal thinking. He no longer calls himself I compare him in certain ways with the Stanislav Grof. Grof kind of seems to have had these kind of basic insights that he's refined over time, but the stances remain quite the same. Wilbur has evolved quite a bit since his earliest books. His first book was called Spectrum of Psychology, I think. Yeah, the Spectrum. And there he was using the image of a spectrum to try to generously make room for different ways of approaching the psyche. You had psychologists who are coming with very different theories, fields,
Mm-hmm.
and they conflicted with one another. And Freud kicked people out of his inner circle, and Ronk went, and Jung went, and so they had these different ways of looking at the mind. And what Wilbur tried to do was to say, well, let's say they're all true, and they all fit together. And he used a kind of spectrum by saying it fits together depending on what you consider human identity. I can't go into the details of that, but you have a wider and wider sense of what your identity is, from the narrowest sense of the human body to the ego, and these different branches of psychology are addressing different stages of that development along the way. And then what he did that had a major impact at the time was he took that up through the major fields that were conflicting with each other in psychology in the epoch. This is in the 70s. And he then integrated into it Eastern thought. He said that identity gets wider and wider, going by the same fundamental view of the psyche that we're talking about, until it stretches into something, that's other dimension of existence. And then and that's where the East has proven so adept. And so he tries to integrate Asian views of spiritual development in with this Western view of psychology. So if you follow the spectrum up the scale, it's as if the West begins at these lower levels of identity, and then the East travels further along as you get to higher and higher stages of spiritual development. Now, he backs off of that to some degree, and there are others who argued it's just too hierarchical and not pluralistic enough.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then he begins to refine these different stages and see the psyche as the stages of development as affecting many different aspects of the psyche, and they don't all have to develop at the same rate at the same time. So it gets to be quite a complicated vision. But then the other thing he does, which I think is a real contribution, he begins to apply this kind of spiritual thought to other fields of other fields of sociology and anthropology, and he comes up with really a remarkably comprehensive system about human evolution. His magnum opus is called Sex, Ecology, Spirituality, and he's written many books, but that one I think is one that will certainly hang around. And it's and he envisions human evolution going in these, and he ties it all to a sense of evolving into greater and greater stages of development, and he sees an impact for this spiritual analysis to affect other fields of thought. I try to do a small instance of that in my, I guess it's my penultimate chapter on Abraham Lincoln, when I pull out my historian's hat again and analyze the Gettysburg Address according to the transpersonal psychology of Stan Grof, and try to make the perhaps outrageous claim that a century and a half of explaining the power of the Gettysburg Address over the American psyche has been missing the fundamental aspect of it, which can be traced through transpersonal psychology. We won't go into that, but in any case, you wanted to talk a little. Oh, let me just throw in that Wilder made great use of this notion of the spectrum.
Me too.
One thing that that this book does is show how that spectrum was made use of by my earlier figures as well. And this Frederick Myers makes use of it in a way that I think really has explanatory value that is getting exploited now in a certain revival of Frederick Myers by psychologists at the University of Virginia, named Edwin Kelly, and others. There's a whole cohort. They're associated with the Esalen Institute. Esalen has played a big role in this, Michael Murphy. But the notion is that consciousness has this full spectrum, and just as our vision can track only a small segment, a small band of that spectrum with of the spectrum of light waves, we see only a small segment of what's going on in terms of the waves out there. That consciousness can be like that. Our normal everyday consciousness sees this small band, but there are things going on that we have access to, both internally, as you can swing a golf club and know exactly where to put the golf. You don't think that out rationally. But it can also result in genius. Suddenly, Mozart says he didn't write the symphonies; they just kind of came to him. He just wrote them down. And a lot of people had that experience where there's clearly something has been being processed in the unconscious mind that bursts into consciousness in some way through some catalyst.
Well, and the thought that comes to mind for me is how what we know when we know this, we know that human consciousness, and it's weird that term brings up so much with it, but I'll just use it right now. Human consciousness is a limiter in some way, and I love the filter, right? It is only able to select particular information, experience, and a lot is left out, right? And so what we have is other senses that we don't practice or even understand or even acknowledge that that could help us at least connect with the unknowable or recognize or be in relationship with it. But truly what's happening is we are limited by the nature of that consciousness. And so what all these folks are saying is that we have we have ways of connecting with that which is beyond our own limitations. And the irony is that modern science and a lot of people in science are looking at panpsychism as a very real understanding of consciousness. I mean, there are like mathematical equations now that are laying this out.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And the it's that consciousness, it's not only begins to be validated in scientific procedures that I'd never pretend to understand,
right?
But it's also it also becomes available to us individually, and that takes us to the theme of your that you wanted to get to about the psychedelics. One of my favorite quotations from William James is this. He had a experience with nitrous oxide, which was used in dentistry in his time, and he ran into a figure by the name of Benjamin Paul Blood, who wrote a privately printed book called The Anesthetic Revelation, The Anesthetic Revelation, where he had his own mystical experience on nitrous oxide, and he runs with that and explains it. So James tried it. And he said, one conclusion was forced upon my mind at that time, and my impression of its truth has ever since remained unshaken. It is that our normal waking consciousness, rational consciousness as we call it, is but one special type of consciousness, whilst all around it, parted from it by the filmiest of screens, there lie other forms of consciousness entirely different. Mm-hmm. We may go through life without suspecting their existence, but apply the requisite stimulus, and at a touch they are there in all their completeness, definite kinds of mentality that probably somewhere have their fields of application and adaptation. Mm-hmm. No account of the universe in its totality can be final, whilst these other forms of consciousness are quite disregarded. Mm-hmm. So, and he never let go of that. He was not mystically inclined. I mean, he wrote the classic work on mysticism, and he investigated. He wrote the classic work on religious experience, but he himself didn't. He saw himself as more of an investigator, not an experiencer. He did have a couple of experiences in nature, in the once in the Adirondacks and once in the Alps, in which he had some kind of pretty moving, numinous experience. But in any case, he never let go of that drug experience. And he had that same conviction that Buck had, that this is the key to something really real. Mm-hmm. And now, as you well know, we're in a moment when a figure like, I think Stanislav Grof will be vindicated in the way that Carl Ruck has been vindicated by Brian Moresky.
Right.
Stan was using these LSD investigations and other forms of psychedelics up until it was shut down by the government. And then a little beyond that, he managed to be with the particular place he was working in Maryland was kept open, apparently because the congressman from Maryland had the experience himself. We don't know that for sure, but it looks
allegedly.
In any case, so he later developed the breath work and continued this exploration through other non-drug ways of contacting these further limits of our nature, and many cultures do this routinely without drugs, some with, but there are other avenues, right? But he had we're now at a point where that work is being revalidated. A lot of the work done in the 60s and 70s is being um, again done in ways that people think of as original, but in fact it's a revalidation of work
Right.
that was extensively done then, and it's being carried further. So we're in that kind of revival that I think would make for exciting times in your profession.
Holy moly, it sure is. It's so radical though that it's I don't know, chicken or the egg here, but it's being validated scientifically, and now it's certainly being validated economically, and of course that scientific validation is what's necessary. And we need to be mindful and conscientious. We're playing with non-rational parts of ourselves, and so we do need to keep our feet on the floor, but certainly creating opportunities for people to have religious experiences in safe, contained, and therapeutic ways, keeping in mind that the term therapy is caretaking, and psychotherapy means caretaking of the soul. And so to be conscious of that non-rational, non-egoic, we don't have to posit some kind of theological reality. We can just say there's something beyond our ego-rational experience, and what we do is tend to call that soul.
Beautiful, John.
So, yeah, continue. Yes.
One plug.
Yeah, plug away.
The people involved in the holotropic breathwork and related fields like guided imagery and music have been working on the ways to do that in that contained contained manner in the last 50 years.
Yeah.
And that has, I think, something that can carry into this revival of psychedelic work. And we do that in Houston through holotropic breathwork Houston. I might encourage your audience to be in touch with that.
There'll be a little link that just appears at the bottom of the screen just then. So yeah, I'll prop it up.
Search for holotropic breathwork Houston. You'll find a website.
Good. And I'll say again, check out Mark's book, and I'll have information. And anywhere you want to send anybody besides the holotropic breathwork Houston?
To the whatever is coming out of John Price's explorations, the interviews, and his vision about how that will develop into his own station and book.
Thank you for that. Mark, it's great. It just for everybody viewing, Mark and I are slugging it out on the curriculum committee of the Jung Center, and Mark's been very involved in the Jung Center, and I'm overjoyed to connect with you in this way today, and I feel it's a blessing to have read your work. So anybody curious about these ideas, Mark's a fantastic ambassador of transpersonal psychology and where it fits in the kind of our psychological and spiritual transformations that are occurring culturally. So thank you very much for doing the work that you do.
Bless you, John. Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed it.